So this week we're once again dipping our toe into the sea of films so embarrassed by the franchise that they've come from that they purposefully try to name the film something so unrelated to the franchise as to try and distance themselves from a tainted brand. This is usually done to confuse audiences into thinking that they're actually seeing a new and edgy horror film rather than a shaved, flea-bitten mutt of a film twice removed. This was a particularly common practice in the late 80s and 90s. By that time, the home video market had become oversaturated with films, so much so that it quite literally got to the point where most people had the ability to see pretty much any film made whenever, wherever. And with the rise of direct-to-video, rights owners found themselves in a bit of a problem, as their continuous milking of once somewhat popular film brands began to draw nothing but dust. Thus, they would continue to pump out films within a film's universe, but retitled to something so loosely connected to that universe as to allow them to stand on their own, but still be loosely tied in enough so as to keep the more brand-aware and hardcore fans coming back time and again. We touched on this in one of my earlier reviews for Primal Species, which was also known as Carnosaur 3 Primal Species, depending on where it was playing. Think of it as the 90s equivalent of what in modern day terms would be referred to as a soft reboot. They relaunch and promote a film or series as something new and cutting edge, but then reveal it's actually tied to an older, slightly worn out franchise, but so loosely that it can be enjoyed on its own merits. And today it's no different. Demon House is a 1997 haunted house Evil Dead knockoff that tried to squirm away from its parent series. You see, Demon House is actually the third film in the Night of the Demons series, and in some places it's even known as Night of the Demons 3 Demon House. However, in the UK it's just called Demon House. And as a result, I ended up with my copy of this film via one of the cheapest 3-DVD multi-pack sets I've ever purchased. I had no idea while watching this that this film was part of the Night of the Demons series, but there are some pretty glaring moments that seem to be harkening back to earlier movies. Unfortunately, I haven't seen either of the other Night of the Demons films, so I can't comment on exactly what they're trying to harken back to, but the film does work more or less as its own standalone thing, so that was a plus. It's also not too mentally taxing either, which was a small mercy because I think had they gone down the lore route with this one, I'd have probably lost patience with it very quickly. The film opens with a police officer doing his rounds and looking for a quiet night, so he decides to patrol an old abandoned house. It's here he encounters a mysterious woman, and the two basically spend what feels like 20 minutes, but was probably only actually 5, discussing what I believe to be the plot of the previous movie in painfully written exposition. The cop is then murdered, and we're then introduced to our main characters for this film, who, I have to be completely honest with you, were only slightly more memorable than the cast of Alien Species, none of whom I can honestly remember any of their names for. And because this film didn't have the balls to even bother to be honest with me about where it came from, I can't even be bothered to go and look up the character names. So here we have Dickhead with a Shotgun, the Lesser Dickhead, Revenge of the Nerds, a guy who spends almost the entire film dying, Hooker with a Heart of Stank, and 2 cheerleaders who were introduced separately at a slightly later point to the rest of the cast in this film. The core gang of twunts are bored and looking for fun, so they decide to hit up a gas station for some beers with a fake ID. But when it doesn't quite go to plan, it ends with one of our dickheads accidentally murdering a police officer and a wild gun battle and escape plan occurs. While trying to escape, we meet up with our 2 cheerleaders, and the film couldn't try hard enough to sell us on the idea that one was a plain Jane and that the other was a golden goddess if it tried. The cheerleaders have broken down in the middle of nowhere, the dickheads pick them up, and they all decide to hold up in the house that the police officer was patrolling in the opening credits. But all is not as it seems. An evil presence hangs around the house, an evil only restrained by, and this is just a travesty of plot writing, underground ancient pure waterways. And as the teens slowly get picked off, the question quickly becomes apparent. Which of them will survive the demon house? Right off the bat, I'll get my biggest criticism of this film out of the way. The actual dialogue for this film is ridiculously poor. The writers have clearly never heard of iceberg theory because characters just vomit exposition at each other in such a way that borders on them almost talking directly to the audience over the characters in the actual production itself. And because of this, it just feels incredibly unnatural, and not in an accidentally good way even, in a disjointed, slightly unpleasant way. This isn't a subtle film, and yet it feels surprisingly restrained in what it wants to do from a plot perspective. This is Demon House. It's supposed to be full of blood and guts and gore and violence and sex and drugs, and there's just none of that at all. Though that may be more in part to the genre it's technically housed in. The haunted house genre of filmmaking is a long-standing traditional horror genre, with titles going back as far as The Old Dark House, right the way through to The House on Haunted Hills, right up to and including the modern day. Demon House is basically a 90s stab at this genre, and there is where it falls apart its quickest. These films rely on suspense, shock, and mystery to invest the audience, and then, when done right, a decent payoff satisfies them by building expectation and keeping them coming back for more. It's not a genre that's easily done well, and the vibe this film gives off really makes me genuinely think that the people who made it thought they knew the genre when in fact they had no clue. With the exception of one very peculiar and quite inspired shot of a demon hiding in a panning mirror shot, the rest of this movie is just lowest common denominator painting by numbers schlock. And poor schlock at that. This film was brought to us by director Jim Kaufman, who has a pretty decent back catalogue of directing and assistant directing credits in fairness. His biggest credit is that he AD'd on the Cronenberg classic Scanners, and he was also involved in directing Gothica, which, and this may be nostalgia talking, I don't recall outright hating. The direction here is arguably the best thing about this film. It's incredibly 90s and arguably a good specimen of its time, as it's a post-Scream horror movie that looks like a pre-Scream horror movie. Seriously, it looks about 8 years older than it actually is. There are plenty of slow panning shots, Dutch angles and tracking shots on display, and I would say it was overall relatively competent in what it's trying to do, if not a little bit dated for the time. There are some slightly wobbly cinematic choices here and there, and quite a few of the demon prosthetics are bad to passable in terms of how much they look like dollar store Halloween masks. But for the most part, the cine and the direction both work hand in hand to deliver a film that, while far from excellent, looks like an early 90s horror and feels like a 90s horror. Yes, the lighting choices in this are basically blue and Poundland Suspiria, but hey, if you're gonna steal from the greats. Writing duties here fell to Kevin Tenney, who, as far as I can see, has only really ever written for the Witchboard franchise in terms of things of note. This is another franchise that I haven't actually seen, but if the writing here is anything to go by, I'm really not missing out on much. For what should be a simple enough plot, they really couldn't have gone more arse over elbow on this one if they'd tried. The plot is thudding, the dialogue is stodgy, hard-going, and overly detailed, and the characters are two-dimensional, poorly constructed, and narrowly driven. They change personalities depending on what the script requires of them, and it's apparent that Tenney really didn't seem all that invested in these characters. Which is surprising, really, because he actually directed the very first Night of the Demons movie. Not one to speculate here, but if I was playing devil's advocate, and I'm definitely not saying that this was the case, but I feel like Tenney may have wanted the directing gig on this one, but got offered the writing gig due to his ties to the first movie, which he begrudgingly accepted. Again, not saying that happened, but for a script to be this bad, there's got to be some motivation for the malice in here. While I've touched on the dialogue being poor, I haven't actually spoken about the acting. Unfortunately, this isn't much better. While I would argue that some of the casting here was pretty much spot on for what the script requires, there are just some performances in this that fall pretty flat at times. Odd moments that left me groaning or generally just feeling overall nonplussed by what was being done. Add to this some CGI which, even for the time, I think would have looked a little bit cheap, that in 2019 looks positively clip art-esque, and you pretty much end up with a film that, while sort of competent, has a lot of holes and is just quite a generic watch. In fact, the only thing I haven't mentioned here that I feel I probably should at this stage is that the soundtrack is pretty okay. It's archetypical grunge heavy 90s bollocks, but I've heard much, much worse in much better films. So yeah, that one gets a thumbs up from me. Night of the Demons 3 Demon House was released on DVD by LLC in 2005, and that's literally the beginning and end of its release history beyond a possible VHS release. I honestly can't find enough information to confirm that this was ever released on tape. It almost certainly hasn't had a Blu-ray release at this point, though to be honest, given the quality of this film, a DVD version more than suffices. The picture quality is decent enough, and I really can't see what a 1080p crisp Blu-ray could bring to proceedings except for making the CGI look somehow even worse. It's currently out of print, but it's dirt cheap on Amazon if you're curious. Demon House was a way to kill 82 minutes. It wasn't a particularly enjoyable movie, but it did have some elements going for it. It's a half-hearted and honestly fairly generic picture, and that's its biggest stumbling block. There's horror, but it's very subdued. There's sex and nudity, but nothing memorable and certainly nothing risque. It tries to be arty, but it just apes other films and does a much poorer and much more half-hearted job at it. It's a haunted house movie for the Dumb and Dumber generation. I most likely will never watch it again. Certainly can't recommend it, but it's not bad enough for me actually to actively talk you out of checking it out. It's a bit bloated and a bit too stagey, but if you need to kill 82 minutes in such a way that you have no memory of any time passing at all, you've found your movie. Oh god, I completely forgot to mention about the retired cop. Right, okay, so one other thing that bothers me about this movie before I go. So, just after the shootout at the gas station, a B-plot gets started about a cop who's one day away from retirement, who decides that this case is going to be his last one. The film keeps cutting back to him as he randomly drives around, then the clock goes past his last day and he's technically not a cop anymore, just in time for him to find the demon house at the end of the film, and then he does some old guy, bad cop breaking all the rules shit, and then this elderly cop who hasn't been directly involved in the plot in any way, shape or form effectively saves the day before being immediately killed. It's painfully stupid, totally sideswipes any payoff or character development you had invested, and it's just stupid. So stupid. The aneurysm is strong with this one.